What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we are going to be talking about my top 24 wide receivers for redraft fantasy football. I did the running back version of this video on Tuesday, so if you guys haven't watched that video yet, you guys can go watch that video. I will link it in the description. But like I said, we will be talking about the wide receivers in this video. And like we did in that running back version, we are going to look at my rankings in comparison to Fantasy Pros ECR. And we are going to talk specifically about where I see some differences in my rankings and in my tiers compared to where Expert Consensus is ranking them. So I'm not going to lie to you. Looking at the top 8 wide receivers in my rankings, there are 0 differences between me and experts right now. It seems like I am chalked the same way as them. So we will look at these very quickly. Right now in my tier 1, I have CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill. So these are my top 2 wide receivers. I think these guys are the elite of the elite tier. And then moving on to my tier 2, we have guys like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, who I do have moving down my ranks just a tiny bit because obviously Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy this year, but Justin Jefferson should still be super elite this year. We also have Amon-Ra, St. Brown, and AJ Brown in this tier as well. So nothing crazy about this tier in general. These are all still very good, very elite wide receiver ones. And then in that tier 3, we do have Puka, Nacua, and Garrett Wilson. So these are the next guys up, the young guys that have shown us flashes. We expect Garrett Wilson to take that step forward with Aaron Rodgers under center finally. Puka Nacua, obviously, he gave us a big season last year as a rookie. So now that we have the basic rankings out of the way, what those top 8 guys are, like I said, you guys can see it on the screen. 0 changes between me and ECR right now. It is exactly like this amongst most of the experts in the industry. So I guess I have it the exact same as them. Now, looking at my wide receivers in my tier 4, this is where we start to see some differences. In this tier, I have 4 wide receivers, and I specifically have guys like Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake London, Davante Adams, Brandon Aiyuk, and Chris Olave. So this makes up my tier 4. Now, when we look at the Expert Consensus rankings and we kind of look at where I am differing right now, you see a green circle and a red circle on the screen. That shows you how much higher or how much lower I am than Expert Consensus right now. So I am 3 spots higher on Drake London than Expert Consensus rankings, and I'm 2 spots lower on Davante Adams. So let's talk a little bit about Drake London. Let's talk about why I'm a little bit higher on him than consensus. And when you look at his current ranking right now, I have him as my wide receiver 10. His underdog ADP is the wide receiver 10 as well. And then you look at the 2023 fantasy points per game, he averaged 10.9 fantasy points per game, which was 42nd best in the NFL. Now, Drake London, he obviously has never given us high-end production in his short time as an NFL pro, but this really isn't necessarily his fault. London has been burdened with horrible quarterback play for the entirety of his career. He's played with guys like Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, and Taylor Heineke. However, he did receive a major quarterback upgrade this year. He now gets Kirk Cousins, formerly of the Minnesota Vikings, and is now in line for a major breakout season in 2024. Now, since Kirk Cousins joined the Vikings in 2018, he has targeted his wide receiver 1 in his offense 723 times in 5 healthy seasons as the starter, and that averages out to about 144.6 targets per season going to his wide receiver 1 and an average of 8.5 targets per game. Now, in 2023, in games where Drake London saw 8 or more targets, he averaged 16.62 fantasy points per game, which would have made him the wide receiver 11 in fantasy points per game last year. Drake London also proved that he has big play potential. He recorded 18 contested catches in 2023, which was the most in the NFL. And even though that's not necessarily the most important thing for fantasy football, it shows that he can go up and get the football no matter where it's thrown to him. It's also worth noting that the Atlanta Falcons, they have made a change in their coaching staff this offseason, moving on from Arthur Smith and now moving towards a Raheem Morris and Zach Robinson pairing, which does bring a lot of that Los Angeles Rams influence to this team. Now, that Rams influence is also going to be very familiar for a guy like Kirk Cousins because the Kevin O'Connell and the Wes Phillips offense in Minnesota over the last couple of seasons, that is coming from that Rams coaching tree as well. And I think it's important to bring up because in these offenses, we've seen guys like Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, all of these types of receivers get hyper targeted in those offenses, and all of them have become massive fantasy football producers as well. So I definitely see a path for Drake London to take the step forward this year, become the wide receiver 1 for Kirk Cousins, be hyper targeted, and then become a producer for our fantasy football teams. So he's definitely a guy that I'm willing to take a shot on in my fantasy football drafts, and a guy that I'm a little bit higher on than the consensus. Now let's move on and let's talk about a guy that I'm a little bit lower on in this tier. We'll talk a little bit in depth about Davante Adams, wide receiver for the Las Vegas Raiders. receivers, and you currently look at where I have him ranked, I have him as my wide receiver 11. Over on Underdog, he's actually being drafted as the wide receiver 14, and looking at his 2023 season, he averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game, which was the 15th best in the NFL. Now, Davante Adams, he saw a ton of volume in 2023. He finished second overall in targets, target share, target rate, route participation, air yard share, and red zone targets. However, only 63% of Davante Adams' targets last year were catchable. Only Garrett Wilson saw a lower catchable target rate than Davante Adams. And on top of this, the quarterback situation was only minorly addressed by the Raiders this offseason. Now, that type of volume, it's always going to be a recipe for fantasy football success, even if you aren't super efficient with your touches. And for the most part, Adams wasn't efficient in 2023. He was outside of the top 24 wide receivers in yards after the catch, yards per route run, and fantasy points per target. And it's pretty easy to paint a picture of Adams slowing down at his older age, and while he is on a bad Raiders offense that really just wants to run the football. And there is also a chance that he doesn't see quite as much volume as he did in 2023 with the major addition of Brock Bowers and a minor addition of a wide receiver in Michael Gallup. And even when you go back and look at last season for Davante Adams, he finished outside of the top 12 wide receivers in 13 of his 15 games played last year, and he finished outside of the top 24 wide receivers in 11 of his 15 games, meaning that he was only a wide receiver 1 for your team 13% of your weekly matchups, and he only finished as a wide receiver 2 or better in 26% of your weekly matchups last year. So at his current ECR of wide receiver 9, that just feels way too risky for me, and even at my current ranking at wide receiver 11, it does feel like it's kind of hard to trust Davante Adams. But at the end of the day, this is Davante Adams we are talking about, and he has been so good for so damn long. Plus, I'm not numb to the fact that there is potential room for some minor improvement with the quarterback play with Minshew under center, but there are some guys in this tier here that I just feel a little bit more comfortable drafting than a guy like Davante Adams, who is going into his 32-year-old season. Now, moving on to my next tier here, we do have our tier 5. I have 6 wide receivers in this tier. The wide receivers are going to be Mike Evans, Deebo Samuel, Nico Collins, Jaylen Waddle, Michael Pittman Jr., and DJ Moore. So now looking at this tier and how my rankings compared to ECR, you see I'm a little bit higher on Michael Pittman Jr. than the community, and I'm a little bit lower on DJ Moore than the community as well. So let's talk a little bit in detail about these guys, starting with Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts. And this is a guy who I currently have as my wide receiver 18 in my rankings. You look at his underdog ADP, and he's actually being drafted as the wide receiver 24. So there's a pretty significant gap in value that you could have in my rankings compared to where he's being drafted in underdog drafts. And then when you look at his 2023 fantasy points per game, this is a guy who averaged 15.6 fantasy points, and that was 14th best in the NFL. Now, Michael Pittman Jr., he is coming off of a fantasy football season in 2023 where he saw a ton of volume. He posted top 10 numbers in targets, target share, target rate, snap share, and red zone targets. And not only did he see the volume, but he was also very efficient and productive with his opportunity, posting top 15 numbers in receptions, receiving yards, yards after the catch, juke rate, and contested catch rate. And even though by itself this is all very impressive, it is also worth noting that he saw a target quality rating last year outside of the top 50. So it's not even like he was getting some good footballs. He was just productive and efficient with some bad footballs being thrown his way. Now, this is no surprise to me because he continues to show us that he is one of the NFL's most underrated wide receivers. He posted a 74.8% success rate versus man coverage in 2023, which was an 80th percentile success rate. And he also cleared an 80% success rate versus zone and press coverage for the 3rd straight season. And because of that, the Indianapolis Colts, they awarded Michael Pittman for his patience and his performance over the last couple of years by extending him this offseason. But it looks like finally Pittman is going to get to play with the quarterback of the future in Anthony Richardson, who did show us some glimpses last season, and he showed us an ability to find Michael Pittman on some of his best routes. Now, even though the Colts have added a guy like Adonai Mitchell in the NFL draft, who I have talked highly about this offseason for Dynasty Fantasy Football, this is still Michael Pittman Jr.'s team, and I expect similar production here in 2024 to the production that he gave us last year. Now, let's move on and talk about a guy I'm a little bit lower on. We will talk about DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, and right now in my rankings, I have him as my wide receiver 19. Over on Underdog Fantasy, he is being drafted as the wide receiver 21. And when you look at his 2023 fantasy points per game, he averaged 16.9 fantasy points, and that was 9th best in the NFL. Now, DJ Moore, he had a great fantasy football season in 2023, and he gave us probably one of the best single game performances of the year in week 5 when he torched the Washington Commanders for 230 yards and 3 touchdowns, finishing the week with 49 fantasy football points. He also posted career highs in receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, touchdowns, and fantasy points per game in 2023. However, this was all while being on a depleted Bears offense with guys like Cole Kmet, Darnell Mooney, Tyler Scott, Khalil Herbert, Roschon Johnson, and even a guy like Robert Tonyan being the only real pieces around him in this offense. Now, it's easy to look at DJ Moore's situation in 2023 and say, yeah, obviously DJ Moore is very talented and he was very good last year for the Bears, but they had to use him. They had nobody else on this offense. But going into 2024, this is no longer the case for DJ Moore, so you could very well see a decrease in volume for him. The Bears' new offense obviously has rookie quarterback Caleb Williams, who should be a quarterback upgrade for Moore, but rookies just don't produce the same passing stats as veteran quarterbacks early on because teams tend to work the rookie in slowly and they do tend to lean on the run game. And more importantly, the Chicago Bears, they've added a ton of target competition for DJ Moore by bringing in guys like Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, DeAndre Swift, Gerald Everett to add alongside all of the weapons that they had last year minus Darnell Mooney. Now, I may be lower on him than the expert consensus right now, and I don't think that DJ Moore is going to be a bad player by any means, but with his current ECR being the wide receiver 16, I do prefer to draft guys like Nico Collins or Michael Pittman Jr., who are currently being ranked behind him in that expert consensus. And now moving on to my tier 6 here, we do have 5 guys to round out the top 24, so in order, we do have DK Metcalf, Devonta Smith, Stefon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, and T. Higgins rounding out the top 24. So looking at the ECR and where we differ here, really the only major difference on the screen is Stefon Diggs, and I'm about 2 spots higher on him than the consensus. So let's talk a little bit about Stefon Diggs here, who is now a member of the Houston Texans. Like I mentioned, I currently have him as my wide receiver 22 in my rankings. Over on Underdog Fantasy, you can draft him as the wide receiver 23, and you look at the 2023 fantasy points per game, and he averaged about 16.1 points, good for the 13th overall wide receiver. Now, the narrative surrounding Stefon Diggs hasn't necessarily been great this offseason. Diggs, he had a major downfall in the back half of last season, failing fantasy managers in the fantasy playoffs, and on top of that, he turned 30 years old and he found a way to get himself traded away from the Buffalo Bills, which was a great situation for Stefon Diggs, and now he's moved on to the Houston Texans into a crowded wide receiver room. Now, all of these things combined have caused Diggs to fall outside of the top 20 wide receivers in ADP, and maybe that's rightfully so, but Diggs, he still posted a year in 2023 of 107 receptions for 1,183 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns. And more importantly, on top of that, Diggs finished as a wide receiver 2 or better in 58.8% of his games last year, which at this ADP, you're drafting him as the wide receiver 2 or the wide receiver 3 on your roster. Now, obviously, this is a different situation, but it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where Houston trades for this type of wide receiver without prioritizing him as a piece in this offense during this contending window that they are currently in. And although Diggs isn't necessarily a major deep threat at this age, that's okay because that is what Nico Collins and Tank Dell are here for in this Houston Texans offense, and Diggs is most likely going to be the underneath volume type of wide receiver as a much needed safety net for CJ Stroud, and I still expect him to get about 100 targets here in Houston this season. So even if and when Stefon Diggs takes a step back from those wide receiver 1 numbers that he was posting in Buffalo, I do think that Diggs can still be a safe wide receiver 2 in this Houston offense with spike wide receiver 1 weeks, similar to what we saw from guys like Michael Pittman Jr. and Brandon Aiyuk last year. So there you have it. That is my top 24 wide receivers for redraft fantasy football going into the 2024 season. Obviously, these rankings are going to change and adapt over the course of the offseason as we get closer to the NFL year. But if you did enjoy today's video, go ahead and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. And if you did like this video and you haven't watched the running back video yet, go watch that running back video. It is linked in the description. And also make sure you guys are subscribed to this channel and make sure you hit that notification bell. That way you guys never miss any future uploads from us in the future. Looking forward to helping you guys win some redraft fantasy football championships later this fall. And last but not least, make sure you guys go join our Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description. I am in there helping you guys with your fantasy football teams, redraft, dynasty, best ball, anything you need. I got you. Go join that Discord. Like I said, free to join, so no risk in doing that. With all of that out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.